Okay, price floors. Price floors. First of all, let's talk about what a price floor is. It is a legal binding restraint on the price so that it cannot go too low. So it can go anywhere above the floor, but it can't go through the floor. So it is often used above equilibrium. Rarely do people say equilibrium is too high. So here's supply, here's demand, here's our equilibrium, and the price clears because the quantities agree. A price floor is usually set above the price, and it is a law that the price cannot reach down here. So it can't reach equilibrium. It can get as close as it can to it, because remember, when you're above equilibrium, there's forces pushing the price down. The laws of supply and demand, if freed, will arrive at equilibrium price. But because there's a law, it can't get there. So the equilibrium price is not what's going to happen. Instead, we're going to have a quantity off the demand curve here, and we're going to have a quantity from the supply curve at that same price. So this will be the price with I'm going to put an F there for floor. So there will be quantity supply. Now we need to understand, if we're talking about, say, minimum wage, farm price supports also are price floors. The federal government will come along and say a certain price of milk is the minimum that we will allow farmers to sell milk. So consumers have to pay more for milk. But that does provide farmers with a higher price. Minimum wage works the same way, where we say we don't like the current equilibrium wage, we think that's immoral, and so politicians say, we're going to say it's a law, you can't have a wage lower than a certain specified amount. So that basically says, the wage can be above that, but it can't be below that. And if it doesn't reach equilibrium, we're going to have something happening here. But we need to know who the demanders are and who the suppliers are. Okay? So coming back to that question after a little more in-depth, I would say, who do you think? Demand is the employers. And the price is actually a wage with a W, okay? So we've got minimum wage, this one. We've got equilibrium wage, which can't happen because it's against the law. Okay? So employers are the demand. They're demanding workers work hours. And I guess it's not politically correct. For a long time it was called man hours, although that doesn't bother me at all. It basically means like man as in human work hours. But anyway, we could call them worker hours now, but it's just a little harder to say. Anyway, they are hiring worker hours, and the supply is the workers or the laborers, okay? So when we say the quantity supplied, this makes sense, doesn't it? If this was some lower wage was the equilibrium, Shouldn't it be true that if the government's requiring more to be paid, there will be people who say, you know, it's worth the gas to commute into town for this job, or I can now afford childcare, so I can go for a job. And so we should find that the quantity of workers providing work hours increases. But at the same time, employers, they're not in business to provide charity. They might be charitable people, but their business is meant to make money. And the way you make money from hiring workers is if the workers produce more revenue for the company than they cost. So the higher the required wage, the more you require anybody you hire or keep employed to be worth that. So I'm going to come back to that. But for now, let's see. This is the quantity supplied by workers, and this is the quantity demanded by employers at the higher wage. And if you think this doesn't happen, there's lots of stories out there. Seattle, when they raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour. Oh, look, McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King are talking about putting in computerized carols and robotic burger flippers. Literally, just a robotic arm that can flip burgers, and it can keep track of how much time every burger has been on that grill so it doesn't overcook any of them. Probably better than we humans can. So they start thinking, well, if I can get a robot that's going to be cheaper per hour, I'm not going to hire the person, or I'm going to fire the person who's making more than their marginal cost of their labor. So we get this situation happening from being a market clearing situation that everybody wants to work for this wage, can find a job. Now it goes to the quantity that people want to buy is here, right? And over on the other side is the quantity that we want to supply. And so we get a surplus of workers or of labor. We end up creating unemployment in the group we're trying to help. It's kind of an unpleasant thing. Let's look at what happens if for some reason the minimum wage ends up being below equilibrium, because it has happened in the recent past. Well, recent as in when George Bush was president. Time flies faster for old people than it does for you. 8 years ago is a real long time to y'all, but I remember when, I'm going to use real numbers here, the minimum wage was 5 something. I'm going to say $5.15. I don't remember exactly what it was. It was $5.15. Oops, hang on. That's the equilibrium wage. The minimum wage was underneath. Okay, so what have we got here? $5.15, and yet the town was full of signs, and the Wendy's, the McDonald's, the Burger King, the root beer place. The town was full of signs that said help wanted, $7.50 starting pay. So it does happen that the minimum wage perhaps has not kept up with inflation, and or maybe the economy is really heating up, and so we end up with this situation where wages are high. Everybody wants to hire somebody. Wages are high. Wages are $7.50, which in those days bought a lot more, because you do have inflation, and it's been several years. So $7.50 an hour was being advertised in the windows of all of these fast food restaurants, that's traditional minimum wage employment, right? So minimum wage was $5.15, and that's the law, right? So how can they be paying that? Well, remember, this is a price floor, right? Which means the price can be way up here, it can be here, it can be here, it can be here, but it can't go lower. You can't pay someone $5.10. But you can pay them $7.50, which is the equilibrium. Those laws of supply and demand, they work. And if it can reach equilibrium, it will. It's not illegal. With a price floor that's below, that means that it can reach equilibrium. Remember, there's economic pressures pushing it from the top and from the bottom towards the equilibrium, and since it's not illegal, that will be the price. So in this case, the minimum wage or the price floor has no effect. Okay, this is a new camera. I'm going to check and make sure it's still running. I'm still recording. Good. I'd hate to talk for half an hour and find out it wasn't running. Okay, so in this case, the minimum wage has no impact. It's below, the price floor is below the equilibrium point where supply and demand cross. So this was one of those disappointing things I learned when I first became interested in economics. I thought that I was going to find ways to fix things, like raising minimum wage and putting on rent controls, and and the thing about the minimum wage is it has no impact unless it's above equilibrium, at which point, if the minimum wage is above, then it starts creating surplus, which is the same thing as unemployment amongst the groups most needing help. And if we're going to, if I show this video in macro, which is the intention, we're going to go on and we're going to study unemployment, and we'll go through and just look at different groups, different ages, and we'll, there's a bunch of sirens happening right now. Anyway, we'll go through and we'll look at unemployment rates over the past decade and see what's happened over time. And you're going to find some of the groups that we most want to help have had the hardest time dealing with increases in minimum wage as far as unemployment goes. So, let's see.